Good afternoon or evening, depending on where you're joining us. I'm Larry Moore, publisher of Broadstone Books, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the September 2022 edition of our Broadstone Reading Stage. Now, September is National Translation Month, and we're observing that today in a waggish way, playing on the old adage that the United States and United Kingdom are two nations divided by a common language. Certainly anyone who has traveled much in either direction can appreciate how English can sound very foreign, even to native speakers. I recall on my first trip to England, I was trying to negotiate a purchase in a shop, and one clerk in exasperation turned to the other and said, "He knows speaking the English." Well, some 45 years later, I'm still working on it. Today, we're featuring two poets who have bridged that divide, quite literally. Estill Pollock, my fellow native Kentuckian, who has lived for several decades in England, from where he joins us today. And TONY HOWARTH, whose life led him in the opposite direction, growing up in England, but transported to the US as a teenager, where he has lived ever since. So this month, we're transatlantic in real time. Estill Pollock was born in 1950 in Clark County, Kentucky, not far from where I'm sitting right now. And along with working as an itinerant tradesman around the South, he achieved early success with his poetry, publishing in prominent regional and national journals. But after his move to England, he ceased writing poetry for many years before returning to the form with his 1998 publication of the pamphlet Metaphysical Graffiti. Since then, he has had multiple poetry collections published in the UK. And in 2021, Broadstone Books had the privilege of reintroducing him to an American readership with his collection Entropy. And yes, my cat is going to interrupt me continuously through this. This year, we've added a second volume, Time Signatures. Now, as these titles would suggest, he takes on big subjects in his poetry, but his treatment is never ponderous, informed by an encyclopedic knowledge of cultural history, both high and pop. His latest is a collection of narrative and ekphrastic poems and a hybrid of the two, all intended to offer a storyboard of creative energies. And what a range of creativity we find on offer here, ranging from Dickens and Dickinson to Rembrandt and the Beatles, variously encompassing Pasternak and Alan Turing, Mary Wollstonecraft and Kafka, Auden and Brecht, Rubens and Bruegel. It requires both deep erudition and bold imagination to take on such a range of characters, and Pollock is more than up to that challenge. He assures us that everything here is real. Some of it might even be true. TONY HOWARTH has a similar arc in his relationship to poetry, having fallen in love with the form during his youth in World War II era England, especially Wordsworth, whom he says helped him survive a particularly turbulent adolescence. But having found that his poetic taste was out of touch with his times, he turned first to journalism, and after a career at a number of newspapers, he then reinvented himself as an educator, spending his next 3 decades in collegiate teaching. Asked by one school to develop a theater program, he discovered another calling as a professional playwright and director. Only after this very rich and full life did he find his way back to poetry, inspired, appropriately enough, by a 2009 visit to Wordsworth's Dove Cottage in the English Lake District. He committed himself seriously to the craft at the Hudson Valley Writers Center outside New York City, under the tutelage of Jennifer Franklin and Fred Marchand, among others, publishing poems in many journals both here and in the UK. To no surprise, given his theatrical background, he has devoted himself to reviving the form of the verse drama, beginning with his chapbook one-act Wild Man of the Mountain, published by Broadstone in 2021. And now in a new full-length collection of 3 plays, A Hand to Hold. In these plays, a man helps a girl escape forced marriage and sexual bondage in John Smith's despotic colonial Virginia. The poet Anna Akhmatova communes with other women waiting outside a Leningrad prison in Stalinist Russia. And in the present day, a man who first lost his father to divorce and distance deals with the anguish of losing him again in adulthood to the ravages of age and dementia. And it's not much of a spoiler to say that this piece is largely autobiographical. Composed in styles as diverse as their themes, what connects these three dramas is the power of basic human decency to change lives, of a caring hand to hold, reaching out across the darkness. So we have here today two very different poets in style and thematic concerns, but linked by having both spanned national borders in their lives, their writing informed by wide-ranging careers and deep knowledge of history and culture, and sharing a love of poetry which led them back to it after long absence, for which we can be very grateful, as today's reading will demonstrate. In deference to time zone, we're going to begin with Estill Pollock. So Estill, I see you're unmuted, so you can begin, sir.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for those comments. First poem I'm reading is St. Vincent's Hospital, 1953. For Dylan Thomas, the room unsteadies, its angles soft as butter pats, the reading tour a spin of woozy interludes and bar tabs. Caitlin, in later years, agreed, we worshipped at the altar, and the altar was booze. No money in poetry, debt, the constancy of a convent vow. Hack work for the BBC, enough for whiskey, but not the rent. With the New York offer, the Hallelujah Chorus, sold out seats in velvet halls, cash for sonorous surrealities. He read the signs, the gift horse with the bloodshot eye, Hobson's choice for roaring boys pushing 40. Drunk and broke, spinning spitball reminiscence for co-eds and the cocktail hour. He played the part. His wife, her brooding stare, mistook among the autographs as local color from the shires, a rage that read the room for jolies filles of English lit, mostly underage. She said to him, we should be home. Our boathouse nook and lawn, not here, you drowning in your breath, in New York smog and dead lungs dragged from London. Wasting gray, cold sweats, just one more reading and another, and another. Charlatan shadows whispering, this will keep you going. Doubles at the bar and a needle of morphine as chaser. The ambulance, then coma. When she saw him on the ward, Caitlin screamed, are you bloody dead yet? And had to be restrained. Her straitjacket tailored to her temper. Dylan dead that day. Caitlin a long life later, the way every Dilly's sweetheart goes. A settle of blackbirds in the evening light. Rhyme triggers memory. Sprung rhythm tempos, book-ending youth and middle years. The time beyond it, never saved. As when a shiver tracks along the spine, we say, someone just walked across my grave. In the next poem, we meet a young Boris Pasternak waiting to depart with his father on a train at Kursk station in Western Russia. They're approached by a stranger, subsequently identified as the poet Rilke. Then the poem moves forward to the 1930s and the time of the Stalinist purges, and it ends finally in the mid-1950s. The direction of travel for the poem is from a time of idyllic literary sensibilities into one where the writing is weaponized in the service of the state, and finally into a later period of political subterfuge that's memorialized in a work of fiction. Kursk Station, 1900. The stranger raises his hand in greeting. From the train, the boy watches the man approach the carriage, calling, "Herr Pasternak, Herr Pasternak." The boy's father looks up from his newspaper and through the open window offers his hand. The stranger's carapace of Tyrolese cape parting to reveal his own hand in return, his fingers long, delicate, on the smallest, a ruby signet. The boy's father gestures to the stranger, "Herr Rainer Rilke," and to the boy, "My son, Boris." Rilke, on his way to Tolstoy at Yasnaya Polyana, fades with his farewells back into the platform crowds. Boris looks to his father as their Odessa train departs in time-tabled banks of steam. Pasternak, glancing at his son, explains, "I wrote a letter of introduction on his behalf, and Lev Nikolaevich was kind enough to receive him." His father shrugs, offhand, smiling. It was nothing. The Union of Soviet Writers to Boris, 1937. Pasternak. The Union of Soviet Writers concludes that the Union of Soviet Writers concludes correctly that the counter-revolutionary Mandelstam, who writes of our great leader as the peasant killer, incites intellectual unrest, sleepless nights for those otherwise compliant. And did we mention the gallows? To breathe beyond that dance is certainly a knack. Boris to Mandelstam. Your Stalin epigram will get us killed. You never read it here, and I never heard it. The benches on this boulevard are listening, so sit and keep quiet. This is no dacha garden room. A cablegram instructs a hole is dug for you, and maybe me, far out in the Urals. Dead is dead. Never mind destiny. Midnight, and a phone call from the Kremlin. Tell me, Pasternak, what is said in literary circles about Mandelstam's arrest. Tell me your opinion. He is, after all, a genius, is he not? Boris stumbles through his disembodied answer that his philosophy of poetry differed to Mandelstam, that warrants and arrests were not the business of the arts. The voice, cold, mocking, you are mine, fist and glove. I know now these circles do exist, despite all we offered as correctives. And another thing, you seem content to see your comrade swing. Boris stands dumbstruck, the dead line static in his ear. Zanaida asks, who is that this time of night? And Boris whispers, Stalin. Mandelstam to a camp near Vladivostok. First mad, then dead, his body unburied until the thaw, and with the others dumped into a scrape of earth they called a grave. Together now, all the pretty girls and boys, poems, opinions, Soviet toys. Southwest from Moscow, the writer's colony at Perelenka, and the brown two-story set among birches. Boris in his garden offers his hand, D'Angelo nodding in return, Comrade Pasternak. They speak of Italy, and Boris laughs, Italian communists think more of me than do my native commissars. It may be 1956, but they limit me to Shakespeare, as if translating everybody dead will keep me out of trouble. D'Angelo leans towards him. Comrade Pasternak, is there news? At least, I ask on behalf of the publisher, Feltrinelli. Your novel, is it true what we hear? Boris pats him on the shoulder and walks into the house, returning with a bundle, adding, there are notes in places, corrections still to make, but the typescript should do. 800 pages, give or take. The newspaper wrapping opened. D'Angelo reads the typeface Cyrillic. Dr. Zhivago. Boris laughs. Mine the KGB and CIA, the backbiters and revisionist cabals, the brotherhoods of truth and protective corps. When published, they will say, poor sod, now for him, the firing squad. As they walk to the gate, Boris tells D'Angelo, I am reminded of a letter from Marina Savacheva I read again of late. It was 1919, and she met me on the street. I, with an armload of books for my library I was taking to sell, to buy bread. Everyone I knew then is dead. I think our error was, we thought to serve was the same as to be free. Okay, the next poem, it's a long poem. It's also the last poem, so I'm sure we'll get through it together. It's about W.H. Auden and examines his modernist credentials, as well as his personal complexities at a time when homosexuality was illegal in England and elsewhere. He traveled a little in Europe by this time, and in Germany in particular, and his experiences provided the impetus towards his first published poetry, and also through his friendships with Christopher Isherwood and Stephen Spender. Auden and the Imagined Life, 1930. The entry in the diary of the modernist. The poems are difficult because they have to be. The false starts, the disruptive repetitions purify the tried's dead diction. Responsibility taken neither for the audience nor for the poems themselves. No longer the shared lives of cities. No longer shared truths, but private visions, the senses disordered, Alexandrian inflections, a bloom of rust on door locks to empty rooms. Closing. Even as I write this, I disappear. Do I seem to you as Freud or Marx? Do you suspect a dignified unity? Here, the simple narrative is simply the failure of narrative. My focus on the poem, a symbol of life with breath squeezed out, a scarecrow tradition, a chance to deadlift the weight of worlds without pratfalls or buffoonery. Perhaps a trip to Iceland to memorize the sagas, the tales from remote farms where an inbuilt obsolescence dogs the hero work. Morals fated to fat-bellied firesides, ethics to the stony path. To praise, like Yeats, the noble rich, or like Lawrence himself. From isolation and easeful death, authority and abiding coherence. My grandfathers, Anglican clergy, haunting the psyche with Kipling's God. I knew for all their carry-on, the dead are tiresome, their lack of ambition singular, the long odds of heaven as likely as the drowned developing gills. My manifestos are private, the only evidence a dragging footprint in the sand long after I have passed. It seemed to be about borders, frontiers. From my teaching post in a little town, no pious hothouse, no Oxford group of shrill exceptions to the rule, but vagaries of hope, the prophecy or cure, suddenly the map's the same. I look in the mirror and wonder where I am. I first read Eliot in 26 and laughed. The Wasteland, a menagerie of comic and burlesque, then noticed the syntax of past and future folded neatly into our present uncertainty, portents and fragments, knowing winks and rutting satyrs, gnomic where it matters. Father and mother with epiphanies of their own, I, homosexual, they tiptoed from the room, closing the door behind them. Berlin overwhelmed my version of myself as breaker of atoms. My crush on the Yugoslav sentry sunk from sight. I spent the summer in slipstream fever and plain bad luck. So much for Ottava Rima as balm for my condition. In a year or two, I should try again with Christopher or Spender. They always have opinions. In my early play, the chorus remains off stage and knows the fate of characters imprisoned in perceptions of the larger scheme of things. A comfort, perhaps, that there was a scheme at all, not simply irony in pitiless refrain, as when the murderers arrive and all are handsome. My childhood was an album of familial tweed, like a patient in a cobweb of neuroses. Hidden there among the paper lanterns and the pines, the arsonist. The past, a tender twist of public summons and desire. A creature of compulsion, at first high church, then acolyte of Lenin, Proust, and Henry James, in brief, a weather vane of 5-year plans and polished cutlery. I suspect the roadblock to utopia is me. Yeats' machinery of gyres indentured us to giants and the dark side of the moon. And Eliot, Iago-like. After what the thunder said, we knew our pockets had been picked. Shelley, a disgrace. Inventions lacking all detail, a curiosity of anxious phrasing struck in marble poses. No poem ever quite untrue, yet forgery, like asking Picasso to draw a face. I look for love, imagining masked violins, but find as penance for my sins a tangle of heartstrings, electric with regret. The alleyways of London, sparking in the wet. Indifference is easier. In stations and cathedrals, poetry solemn as stone. Lovers with their tickets. I wonder, how shall we redeem ourselves to cleanse salt water from our just beliefs? Ulysses decided self-pity was a vice, coaxing his men with the higher rhetoric of hope and virtue. The sailors, swimming for their lives or drowned, their hollow bones whistling like a flute. A regimen of sacrifice, less in common with Homeric thugs than with Wilfred Owen. Let the chorus clarify this horseplay and save us thinking for ourselves. The roots of tragedy are grease paint and guffaws, as when the lover says, "You are significant, but not to me." Persona excised as petty circumstance and whim, then flies headlong on black banana skin. Dante, in the upper concentricities of hell, found elevation to celestial planes, dependent less on poetry than love, and was bewildered artists held so little sway upon the heaven sent. I too consider bafflement more love's steady state, and poems wretched stuff, extravagant gestures of sympathy and worth, though, like everyone else, I have no answers. When the theater is closed, the dead rehearse the old routines, and raw provincials ask directions to my memories of Berlin, as one might knock upon a cottage door and hear Jane Austen say, "Come in." History mocks our escapades, its clockwork omnibus of names and dates shoaling on the posthumous. The broken mirror jags the mind. The testaments here now likeness only, a token tete-a-tete of promises we never keep. The breath between us sweet as lost tomorrows, fading as we disappear. And that's all I have tonight. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. Estill, what a delight once again to hear the cadence of your language in your voice. It's always a great pleasure to hear you read as well as to read your work.
Oh, thank you.
I realize there's probably no simple answer to this, but of course I alluded in my introduction to how you took a fairly long break from poetry. What brought you back to it? And since it was after you'd been in England for quite a while at that point, how has your poetry changed when you came back to it as a result of becoming an English poet as opposed to having begun as an American poet, if you feel that there's even any meaning in that distinction? So can you talk a little bit about your journey back into poetry?
Well, there was a difference, certainly. I think when I first started to write and publish poetry in was about 17 or something, and carried on in journals such as Poetry and Alcahest and Wesleyan University, that sort of thing, you know, for a number of years on and off. I think it must have been about 1980. I had a poem in a new Kentucky journal called Kentucky Poetry Review. It just came out, and the poem was quite successful, and that was the last poem I wrote for 15 years. Family, work, a move to another country, a lot to do, things were just set aside simply. And but after a number of years, it just it was like water under the door. It just kept coming in, you know. There it was, and I just started up again. Really simple as that. Just sat down and started and tried to build something up again, which fortunately has worked out reasonably well to date. So that's where we are.
All right. And to the point about your Englishness now, do you feel there's a way in which you've changed as a poet through the immersion in that culture, or again, is that a fairly meaningless distinction?
I think the phrase is that I've gone native. That life there over 40 years ago is so remote from my experience now. It is like reading about something else in a book, quite honestly. Yes. So, yeah.
Well, again, lovely to hear you. And I appreciated the fact that Auden and Eliot made appearances in your reading today, those two other transatlantic poets that speak to.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, the sort of the theme that I set for today about poetry bridging those nations. And I'll say as a segue to our next reader, I especially like the Pasternak cycle that you read, because it's really quite dramatic. And I think that's a good moment for me to bring up our next reader, Tony Howarth. And Tony, you're muted, so the first thing you'll need to do is to unmute yourself, and we'll have you join the conversation.
I am unmuted.
You are, sir. Welcome to the stage.
Yes. Shall I begin? Yes?
Yes, all yours.
Okay.
All yours.
All right. I have a book which contains 3 dramas in verse, and I'm going to read one of them from beginning to end, and it's relatively short, about 15 minutes. But I thought that I would like to dive into the other 2 just so that you can get a sense of what they might have to offer. So I'll start with the second one in the book. It's called Beside the Red Deaf Wall. And it's a little awkward to read it because there are a number of characters. There are 3 women, and then there is a chorus. And the chorus, his main purpose in being here is that they read the work of Anna Akhmatova, and the poetry that she put on, excuse me, I'm about to say put on the page, but no, she wrote it, and we'll get to that in a minute. So I have 3 characters that I want you to meet. The first one is Yekaterina, who tells us this: we're outside a prison in Leningrad, at the height of the tyrant Stalin's terror. We come to this prison every day to wait in line in front of the wall with food, messages, gifts. shove them through a tiny window to an officer with a piggy grunt. Do we get to see our husbands, sons, boyfriends, fathers? And the chorus says, no. Ekaterina again. Are we certain they get our gifts and messages? And the chorus says, no. Ekaterina. But we live with hope, our voice of hope, our poet Anna Akhmatova. If she publishes her poetry, Stalin threatens all sorts of punishments. So she doesn't publish, but she writes. What's in her heart, she writes. We whisper her words to one another, memorize them, keep them to ourselves. And Anna says, I have today a lot to do. It's a line from her poetry. And Katerina responds, I need to kill my memory. And Anna and Ekaterina together say, I need to petrify my soul. And everybody on the stage says, I need again to learn how to live. Ekaterina, someone new has come to join us, stands looking lost. We turn away. We don't want her to see our faces. Don't know if we can trust her. Anna says, but she's weeping. And the chorus, tears for the pain that burns her heart. Ekaterina, and she carries a coat, a shoulder bag, stands in the street, pleads for help. Olga, that's the woman. I knock on the door. My brother pushed me into the closet, hit me behind the coats and jackets. I heard thumps, voices, violent. And Anna says, and then Ekaterina says, silence. And it goes on from there, of trying to comfort and help this woman who's in such terrible trouble. The other drama is a little bit more personal. It's about myself and my dad. And well, maybe I'll just read it and you'll get a sense of what the problem might be. I arrived for a one-week visit, find Dad battered down, cardigan torn and splattered, cuts on his forehead and nose. On his way to pay his gas bill, running to catch the bus, he slipped, fell, blacked out, taken by ambulance to the hospital. And Dad says, oh, they looked me over, but not to worry. They found nothing wrong, doing fine. He reaches out to hold my hand, soft and possessive. And how are you? On holiday, are you? Fancy that, coming to see me. Later, in at the front door after a shopping spree, I'm loaded down with groceries and laundry. He waves a dish towel in my face. I'm sorry. You've got to go. You can't stay here. Tony's coming. He needs the room. He turns abruptly into the kitchen. I'm Tony. How do I respond? Padlock my tongue. Move on. Go back to the car. Return with a walking stick I've bought for him. This time he's all smiles. What? Who was that bloke? Do you know him? Wanted your room, but I told him, get lost. You come first. I offer the walking stick. Oh, thank you. But isn't this smashing? But no, I don't need it. You're doing fine. Burnished metal, folding like a tent pole, adjustable elastic inside. I fit it so his hand sits tight in the handle. Smashing. But no, really, what will people say? See me walking with a stick? No. I show him the rubber foot, protection against a slip and fall. Oh, smashing! It truly is. And he disappears. I find him later in the front room, stashing it behind the curtains. Those miserable sods, they'll try and steal it. I know they will. I'll kill them if ever I catch them. It's hard to say that it is dementia, because he remembers that he does things that he has said, which makes it difficult to define it as dementia. But there he is, and I'm living in America, and he's living in England, and I'm the only one who can help him. And well, it's a problem. All right, let's go to number one. Not necessarily number one in quality, but certainly number one in the book. And I need to read this little note ahead of time. The history books tell us of a teenage girl, Anne Burris, who arrived in October 1608 on a supply ship, Mary and Margaret, who then married a laborer, John Leyden, later giving birth to four daughters. But a television documentary detailed an archaeological dig which unearthed in what was a kitchen maiden at the skull of a 14-year-old girl scarred with knife scratches, which suggested cannibalism. Folklore has yet another story to tell, whispered by a tour guide at the Jamestown reconstruction, a tale that made me tremble to imagine how dehumanizing it can be to struggle for survival in a landscape presided over by someone like John Smith. All right, here we go. Narrated by an old man. I am waiting. Anyone defying John Smith, watch out. He'll narrow his eyes, a flash of flame inside. I want to slug him in that face of his, dump him in the river, shove his head under, choke him. The bugger. She's what, 14, 15? He straps her into the stocks, feeds her to his revved up mob. Waiting. Old Drasty. Minute I arrived, that's what they called me. Put me in my place. Bottom of the nobody list. Bugger wanted me sent back right away. Gray hair and droopy shoulders. Out of his line of sight. Put me in the saw pit. Underneath the logs we shape into battlements, breathing sawdust all day long. The bastard! His mob, like barking dogs dragging a squirrel. It's unforgivable. She with her hands locked in the boards. They shower kitchen waste on her, bones that lodge in her hair. Their fingers scritched beneath her skirt, badger her breasts. Nothing she can do but shriek and weep. So I am nobody. Old Drasty, a nobody waiting to help her somehow. He'll tear me to shreds, I know. Even so, I must. Night. the moon beaming down on us. Men gone to their cots, sentry lost in the shadows. I slash my axe against the ropes 3 times, 4. They snap. I pry the stocks open, hold her hand. She howls. I flatten my arm across her mouth. She bites, kicks me away, foots it like a frantic rabbit into the forest. My twisted foot. I stumble behind. She plunges through the grasping undergrowth, squashing it, splintered branches left dangling. I reach out my hand to stop her. Don't you, she yells. Wax and wax me. Face to face, she scoops a handful of dirt, chucks it bang in my eyes. Not to look like that. Not to look at me like that, like all the others. I tell her, no, I'm looking at someone young in dreadful danger. You rush on your feet into the shrubbery, leave a giveaway path. They'll track you down, hold you back. She screams at me, never, not going back. No, never. Poaching on blue blood estates back home. I've learned how to survive in the woods. Footprints soft and silent, lift the branches, lift the feet, walk in the dark of night, sleep during the day. Another danger. Powhatan hunters in the forest, got knives and arrows, out for blood. Perhaps Jamestown is safer. No, she pummels on my chest. Now the spit flying. Never, never. Says she wants to meet the Powhatans. Ask them to take her on to one of their own. Namontauk. They spent time together on the Mary Margaret. He smiled at her, talked to her in English. Who knows why he was taken to London, why he was tied to the mast on the way back. She says everyone snubbed her, but he laughed, chatted with her. She shared the food she was given, brought him a blanket. As I walk in the silence of darkness, stranger to this wilderness, I hear a familiar voice, an owl hooting, as if I'm walking in the woods back home, mournful, sad, by ourselves in the endless forest. I don't know what I'm doing. Wasn't it right? Wasn't it what I did? Took her away from Bugger's claws. I hear the singing of a brook. Should I maybe suggest we follow it? Keep the water by our side, so if we stray, we'll shut away confusion. Always a place to come back to. We find a spot to settle in daylight. Hack branches and shrubs. With the axe I carry in my satchel, build a leaning shelter. Watch her wriggle inside. Give her my coat to wrap herself. Stretch myself out on a bed of weeds, hidden beneath a blanket of branches. Her sobbing wakes me. I want her silent. I beg her to be calm. John Smith for certain has soldiers out looking. With the brook singing past, she weeps me her helpless, what could have been. 6 of them, 5 sisters and a brother, often clustered in front of the fire. They love to sit warm and weave cats' cradles. Love the songs their mother taught them for all the day long. And our owl sits in a tree, and when the night comes, away flies she. When their mother died sudden in her bed, the sisters were bargained off by their father. Scullery maids, farmhouse helpers, brother ran away, not to be seen again. She shares her story, and I'm here to listen. I don't know what to think. unaccustomed. People don't tell me their stories. She's calm at last. I give her a twinkle of bread, stashed in my satchel for hungry moments. Watch her crumple it, stuff it in her mouth. Tell her how my body has been battered for years. Maybe 50, could be more. I do it ever by hiding invisible. As with Bugger Smith out looking for us, we hide by night, sleep by day. Something I've not ever done. Daring to share. Hey, nose, nose, jolly red nose, and who gives you that jolly red nose? So, sotted drunk, I passed out sleeping on the street. A ship's crew carousing past for a lark. They picked me up, dumped me on board, wake me next morning, surrounded by ocean. For a moment, old Drasty, I have her smiling. She scrambles back inside her shelter. I'm left wishing I had fire to my feet, staring into the flames and pondering how she astonishes. When we walk, I feel her on my heels, begging me to pick up speed, desperate to escape her blistering memories. Such as when the Mary Margaret pulled into the dock with her on the deck for all to see, stood beside the man and wife she was bargained to. Because a child born in Jamestown will bring him fame in London, Bugger Smith thinks only of himself, staggers her away to raffle her as a wife. The blacksmith won, rushed her to the church. Asked priest to bless their union, lugged her to his smithy, threw her to the ground to have her. Everyone listening and sipping spit. He snarling, she shrieking. But the child fought him off, wriggled free, left him fuming. Priest in a sermon and condemned her. 'Tis sacred duty a wife must bear a child. Priest and Bugger, godly righteous, strapped her into the stocks. More Jesus than they will ever be. I hate priests, worse than I hate the Bugger. Remember how in a church at home, I sheltered for the night, hidden in the undercroft, and the cleaners came to clean, smashed all the stained glass windows, toppled the statues, everything but a small crucifix. I took him for myself, talked to him like I'm talking now. But priest caught me, stomped on him, like putting out a fire. My companion, my treasure, called me heathen, sat me in the stocks for praying to an idol. As we walk, half the night gone, under a full moon, we come to where the brook spills over a ledge, gurgles into a pond, a place for the water to rest on its way to the river and sea. The bushes all around look like blackberry. We pick and choke down handfuls, tumble flat along the edge of the pool, drink, laughing, drench our faces. Far enough away from Buggertown, I feel safe settling in the ocean or in the open. Sleep with nothing above our heads but sky. Then, during the night, I hear rocks rattling, splashing noises, see her sitting in the pool, washing her hair. Next morning, gone. I wipe my tears. I take the risk of calling out for her. Hello! I've never before walked a path with someone else. Is she following the brook? I can only hope. She'll not return to Buggertown. If straight into the endless forest, she'll be lost. One tree like every other. Hello! Oh, she knows what she wants. No matter what. Gone. To find it. I'll wait here. If she finds him, now Montag, if the Powhatans are kind to her, if he welcomes her, but if not, well, she'll remember the pond. The brook will guide her where I'll be waiting. If I go back to Buggertown, he'll hang me. Waiting by our pond, our waterfall, our brook, in its song well sung, so comforting. First, old Drasty, make a shelter, plenty of branches for wattles, plenty of mud from the pool to daub between them. A place for when it rains, for when it turns cold, for her to come back to. And thank you.
Oh, Tony, it's hard to even get my breath to respond to that. I can only imagine what it feels like to finish that performance, and that's what your work is. Even more than most poets reading their work, it's so performative to hear your presentation. What a delight! Just what an experience to hear that. I'll make a far less serious observation to break that mood. When I had Estill on, we were talking about his move from Kentucky to England. Well, I don't hear any trace of Kentucky, Estill, in your accent anymore. But Tony, even though you've been in the States even more decades, you still sound pretty English to me, which leads to my question. First question. Are you an English poet who happens to be living in America? Sort of the same conversation I was having with Estill about, is there a distinction to be made between English writing, American writing? Do you feel you're an American poet, or are you still, after all these years, an English poet?
Boy, you really put me to task here.
That's my job.
I don't know how to answer it. I think that, to be honest, I don't know if I'm English or if I'm American.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not just talking about poetry.
Right.
Who am I? I am an American citizen, but I'm also an English citizen. Mm-hmm. And there are times when I get very confused. Mm-hmm. And it's an interesting question, because this morning, I just read a newspaper story about a woman who is a priest in the Anglican Church, and she was barred by the church from giving a funeral goodbye to somebody, and the reason for that is that she's married to another woman, and that's a no-no. And that's very confusing for me, because I was very much involved in the church when I was in England, an acolyte. So, you know, it's really something I even contemplated at the time. I was 13, 14, that I wanted to be a priest, which I would not even tolerate thinking at this particular moment. And it set in motion for me the sense of, if I had stayed in England, how would I have felt about this incident I've just told you about? Would I be on the side of the church, or would I be on the side of the woman? And I know which side I'm on now, because there's still that fleeting sense that if I were there, it would be very different. My whole life would be very different if I had stayed there. And the degrees which I'm just very, very confused. Some of the stories, of course, is all black and white. That's unfortunate in our an unfortunate idiom in our society, but there it is. So I can't answer your question.
Yeah, you did. It's a very good answer.
I think at any given moment, I will think of myself as American. At any given moment, I will think of myself as an Englishman.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think I'm laboring that there is a distinction there, but I'm reminded how back in.
Well, I think you're probably right. I think there probably is a distinction, but I quote, I don't know what I'm doing. So it's just sort of, I let it be what it wants to be, and I don't try to guide it either way. I don't try to be English. I don't try to be American. It's just what's there is what's there.
Right. I'm going to ask you one more question, and it's in a completely different angle, because I'm always interested in people who have brought other professions to their poetry. I've had a number of lawyers on our program here, but you're a journalist, or were. You are by training a journalist before you became an educator and a playwright and all the other things that you've been. Do you feel that your background in journalism brings anything specific to your work as a poet?
Yes. I feel it, and I also feel it in my experience in the theater, that I try to write something other than narrative poetry, and I just don't like what I've written. I feel that a narrative is, well, I feel that somehow narrative and sound are terribly important in poetry. Robert Pinsky says that poetry is the melody. You know, it's just so those two things really merge there. And I've tried to write poetry, meditative poetry. I think I can do some sort of meditation, but not to the degree that I hear poets around me working with. There always has to be a story, and I think I can't get away from it. I've tried, but I don't like what I've written when I do.
I don't think I want to encourage you to get away from it, because your writing is so powerful. Your storytelling is so powerful. So it's wonderful that you've brought all of those different elements of your life into your work, as Estill has in his. At this point, I'm going to see if there's anyone else that's with us here today who has anything that they'd like to ask or comment. Since there's few enough of us, I don't think it'll be confusing if anyone just wants to unmute and step into the conversation. You're welcome to do so at this moment. Any takers? Willa, do I see you?
Yes, I have a question for Estelle. Two of them. It seems like you use the persona poem, and I wonder how that became a form for you. And also, I want to hear about how you work in series.
This is me? The question
Willa,
is
Willa,
me?
was your question predominantly for Tony or for Estill or for both?
It was really, I was thinking of Estelle, but I think you both can respond to it.
So Estill, you'll if you want to unmute, you can join the conversation as well. Persona writing.
And also the series about working in series, yeah.
Okay, we'll throw that to Estill to start.
Okay, well, a narrative poem is just simply a story poem. There's lots of formal definition around it, but it's just telling a story about people. And some people are arguably more interesting than others in particular circumstances. In this particular book, I used familiar characters, mainly writers, but the second part of the book is also artists. But again, they're story poems. So it was simply a matter, I mean, quite honestly, that book was written in 2 months. And I wrote it towards the end of the pandemic, I think, around that time anyway. And I just thought, I'm going to write poems based on books I have in the house. And if I'd had some different books, I probably would have written some different poems, but they were the books I had in the house. And I wrote poems on the basis of those lives and those stories. And it developed from there, really. So it didn't actually take very long. It was quite quick. I'm a pretty quick writer, actually. So that's a very practical approach. And I don't prevaricate too much. I just very practical about how I do it and just sit down and do it, really. So
I think I feel the same answer coming forward here. I'm very interested in the world around me, and I really don't want to explore my own soul. I think that if that's what you're asking, I shy away from the ego quality of some meditative work. That's the way I felt it coming out from me, and I didn't like it. I don't talk about myself. Talk about where I am with other people. I need the narrative that I am writing needs a narrator, and it's and really with my smashing piece, I'm there because I want to tell my father's story. It's not my story. It's his. He's the one with dementia. He's the one with the pain. He's the one with the struggle to stay above the, and I just want to help him. But the point for me is that he has problems. I guess it's a personal thing in the sense that but I really, I want you to worry about him rather than me. If that makes sense. I don't know if it does.
Thank you.
Tim, you'll unmute if you have a question, sir.
There we go. Tony, if I might, in the earlier part of the 20th century, Ezra Pound and his friends, shall we call them, pretty much declared that the narrative poem was an impossibility. And for a number of years, I don't think it's been a particularly prominent form. Do you find, and by the way, I'm not denigrating at all, so please understand that. I'm just curious whether you have a sense that there's a tradition that sort of contextualizes or that you can work from, or do you feel pretty isolated in your approach to narrative?
Yes. Yes, very much so. I've been in workshops. I've been in a lot of workshops. And the advice has always been publishers don't like it. Publishers don't like it. So don't write narrative.
Right.
it's almost a given. And I tried. I tried very hard. But I finally told myself, screw it.
Yeah.
You know, I want to write narrative. So I call back, I go on to some of the great works. I mean, can we talk about the Odyssey and Iliad? I know I'm not putting myself on that level, but please, how can you in any really sort of logical way dismiss that, or even just something simply as Coleridge and his cuckoo, his yeah.
Yes.
Well, no, I wasn't thinking Kubla Khan, but where's there? Kubla Khan was obviously going to be
Right.
a narrative, yes. But anyway, I'm thinking of I'm just sorry, I've just forgotten the title
no.
of Coleridge's narrative poetry of the
Rhyme
man
of the Ancient
on the
Mariner.
boat and the
Rhyme of the Ancient
albatross.
Mariner.
Yeah, that's it. Yes.
And Larry knows that I'm being slightly dishonest with you here, because he knows that I have some interest in Robinson Jeffers, who, of course, was a narrative poet among other things. But I also think of people like Edwin Arlington Robinson, who has some wonderful narrative poetry at the beginning of the 20th century that's too little read anymore. And so on, or even Robert Frost. So I was just curious whether any of those counter-modernists in the first half of the 20th century had come into your orbit at all or not. And it sounds like
It came into my orbit. I certainly read the work of, what is that great summer, you know, the subway train station. All right, you know, my memory fogs up on me terribly.
Well, I'll jump in and say that Tim, I appreciate your question, and it's one of the reasons why in my introduction I was praising Tony for reintroducing, you know, the narrative, particularly dramatic verse, which, as you
right.
say, Jean Griggs, it's so nice to have you in the room today, Jean. Jean was praising me for finding a publisher brave enough. I don't know that it has anything to do with bravery. I happen to like narrative poetry a lot. The nice thing about being a publisher is I get to publish whatever the hell I like. So in my case, you know, the first book we published was a collection of narrative poetry. And I think that kind of set the standard for that being a preference, although we've certainly drifted all over the place since then. But anyone else? We're winding down here. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, let's have a round of applause. You can unmute and we can applaud for our readers today, Estill Pollock, Tony Howarth. A really powerful, two powerful voices, both on the page and as you heard them read today, present today. What a pleasure, and as I said, what a fun transatlantic day that we've had, the conversation about American and English and whether that even means anything anymore. I just remember back in my high school days, we'd study American literature and then you'd study English literature, particularly if you were college bound. So we kind of had that dichotomy that I think was always pretty artificial. Anyway, a great pleasure to have these two readers today, and a lot of fun to see our small but mighty audience today with a few have already had to step out. Let me close by just reminding you that we do this every month, pretty much, and we have a couple of readings. I'll go ahead and just get on your radar for the next couple of months. We'll be back here at our regular time of 4 p.m., although I'll be interested to hear, some of you can message me if you want to, about whether you actually found it you preferred this earlier start that we made today out of deference to not keeping Estill up past his bedtime. But we'll be back at 4 p.m. on October 15th when we'll hear from Esteban Olaarte, who will be joining us from Mexico City. So again, we'll be international with that, along with another Brit who lives in the United States now, Billy Cancel, a performance artist now in Brooklyn. That's going to be a really powerful event. You want to come to that one. These are two really, really dramatic voices. And then we'll be back again at 4 p.m. on November 19th, when we'll have 3 poets reading, one of whom was with us but had to leave just moments ago before I got to name her. But Susan Cohen, who was with us today in the audience, and Lowinger and Allison Palmer will all be reading on November 19th. So if you want to go ahead and note that. We've put the links for the books today, Estill's and Tony's books, both of whom have more than one book with us. So take a while browsing on our Broadstone site if you enjoyed what you heard today. I always say, and since it's pretty much all writers that are in the room with me, I don't have to tell you this, but nothing says thanks like buying the books. So if you really enjoyed what you heard today, I'm sure they'd be happy to have you add their books to their library. And Estill, I love the fact that you talked about how it was your library that informed this latest collection, because when the world shut down, you had the world right there at your fingertips with your library. So that's a good note too, to talk about why books matter. Willa just said she prefers 4 p.m. So we got one vote. That's because Willa's joining us from the opposite direction. So very fine. So Willa had to get up early today for this one. All right, everyone. Again, thanks to Tony and Estill. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And Stephanie, you can take us out.
Thanks everybody for being here, turning off the